Kia ora everybody, and welcome to Future Whenua Yarns, because words become worlds.
Oh, I like the upgrade. Yeah. I'm appreciating the condensed version.
Yeah. Well, it sticks to this theme about, the way that we vocalize our thoughts becomes manifest in the reality.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, it does. It on the face of it, it almost seems like one of those things you see sort of scrawled on a toilet door, but it has that lovely, profound quality to it that does keep it stuck in the brain and just rotating away. We probably should introduce ourselves.
I'm Zeb.
And Rob.
And I absolutely hope that concept reigns true in the context of this conversation with Jeremy Lent. He's an author, a thinker. There's been organisations like The Guardian that have considered him one of the most paramount thinkers of our time, and I would definitely add my voice to that assessment. And he's really talking about this big level, where does our place in the universe sit and our place in the broader ecosystem? Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I haven't seen the whole interview yet. I'm pretty damn excited to watch the whole thing after the few chunks that you've shown me so far, and he has a real clarity to the way he's delivering that message, where he is talking about this interconnectedness in every other aspect of our universe, and yet we seem to have sort of taken this, divorced approach where we don't have to be part of these systems. We're sort of, this separate animal, or separate, not even an animal, this separate sort of special being that gets to look beyond, ecosystem.
And so it had this, type of discussion with Shane, and it was really deep in this ecosystems approach, and then also with Lisa actually really toyed a lot of this dichotomy of future and whenua and the different elements beneath those. So having Jeremy, who's just such a master and so articulate in this matter, was a real honour, and I hope you find the depth of his words in the way that I have.
Absolutely, and I hear tell that you introduced a term to him that I've been kind of workshopping a little bit internally.
Yeah. So that's the way he was expressing this relationships within ecology, and so I had to broach this idea of the eco-punk movement, and I was wondering if you wanted to explain.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it was sort of just one of those moments of divine inspiration, or architectural drawing got slid across the desk, where I've been mulling over this idea, and I'm quite enamored with steampunk and diesel punk and all these other sort of modalities of storytelling where you take a specific technological sort of era and you extrapolate it out, over the course of societal development. So, a steampunk being the classic example where you take steam technology, industrial revolution era sort of problem solving and mechanics, and you bring it forward, what would it look like if we never evolved past steam? Diesel punk being a similar idea. There's solar punk, cyberpunk, they all have their own specific genre. So I seem to remember calling you up and talking about, permapunk, which was sort of the idea I had. You threw back eco-punk, which was definitely an improvement. And ever since, it's just been an idea that I'm actually really excited about, because it does give a beautiful sort of visual framing around, what it is that we're striving for.
And so Jeremy's talking a lot about this ecological civilization, and I really think in terms of setting a pinpoint in the future about what are we aspiring to here. This eco-punk idea holds a lot of a container that we can mull out ideas about what that vision actually is.
Yeah, well, it's setting first principles. It's saying, okay, if we go forwards with this aspiration in mind, that it is this synthesis of technology and ecology in perfect, equilibrium, then it creates almost an inevitability that you're going to arrive at that point, because you are sort of building that mental framework that you can then start acting within. And I think, I'm pretty jazzed to go and tell a whole bunch of people to be eco-punks and to join the eco-punk movement, because it does, to me, that's such a cool, it's pop culture, and it's that idea that culture, sort of everything is downstream from culture. There's a guy called Andrew Breitbart who said politics is downstream from culture. And I think he really hit the nail on the head there, because it is, no matter what you're attempting to achieve politically, if the culture isn't with you, it doesn't matter. So you've got to sort of, shift cultural perception and cultural aims before political, outcomes can match.
I guess yeah, we wear these T-shirts that say gardening is cool, and that's sort of for this message. It's like, how do you make this cultural shift towards gardening being cool? But I'd wear an eco-punk hat all day long.
Yeah, 100%, absolutely. Maybe it has a little flower growing out of one corner or something.
Yeah.
Maybe we grow them out of mycelium.
And so ecology is like the scientific analysis of objects and the relationships between them, and the relationships of how they fit within their environment. And so just like really having an exploration of so what does a society that's based around ecology look like, and is it the production cycles and the trades, and like how do people make a living off this, and where are the materials coming from? And,
well, I mean, you could argue that in essence that what capital is energetic exchange. It's a way of moving energy around within the system. So then, but you're right. I love that idea that ecology is more of a study of the relationship between the parts of the system as opposed to the actual components of the system itself. It's the understanding of the interplay between two assets as opposed to what these two individual assets represent as a standalone. So yeah, what a great way of framing the whole discussion of how we view our societies and our communities, because it's not about the physical assets. It's about the interplay between the people and the companies and the ventures that creates the society, that creates this community that we're striving for.
And I just feel deeply honoured to be able to connect with Jeremy, who is just really pushing this message and with such integrity, and hope it lands with you all.
Oh, I can't think of many people who couldn't get something out of this interview. It's just a powerful reminder that we are this connected part of a larger whole. Yeah.
And with that, hope you enjoy. Jeremy, how are we doing, man?
Oh, doing great, Seb. I'm so looking forward to our conversation together. Really, really interested in what you've been doing and sharing our thoughts together.
Nice. So am I. I've been a member of your community, the Deep Transformation Network, and have found some amazing just articles and thoughts to follow and holes to travel down through there. So yeah, thank you for that. And then just a lot of the other work that I've been following, your talks and discussions that are on YouTube have been really profound.
Great. Glad to hear that. Yeah. What has there been something that's kind of that's really interested you in particular that really caught your attention then?
Yeah, this notion of an ecological civilization. The very first time I heard you say those two words, I was just landed so well, because I know that I'm working towards something with Future Whenua, and it's just I actually redefined our mission statement for Future Whenua to be, working towards this ecological civilization and the rural sector, how it plays towards that. So that had a deep impact, and then just all the understandings behind it.
That's great. Yeah. And that idea, that sort of phrase, ecological civilization, had the same impact on me when I came across it a few years back. It's not my own phrase or anything like that. It's something the different people have been working on for years. And when I first heard it, it's sort of like a light bulb went off in my mind. Yeah, like, yes, this is, it just felt like it captured so much. And, when I write about it, which I have done extensively, and I will be doing even more. I'm actually writing a book right now on that topic. But the important thing to realize about it is that it's not like one person's vision or even one group's vision. It's like something that so many of us around the world are working on. And it just kind of gives this name to what each of us know is right in our hearts, like this kind of life-affirming potential for a civilization.
That's incredible. And yeah, civilization is a whole bunch of puzzle pieces coming together to form that up. So you couldn't be egoic enough to try and define the whole ecological civilization. It is really finding your part to push in it. And
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I'd like to tell you about how I actually came across your work, because it's quite intertwined, all of this. But so we started Future Whenua Summit on our farm last year, and then this year moved up to the Hawke's Bay, and we're held on Mangarara Station by Greg Hart, and it's really amazing what they're doing up there. And then, so the Sunday after the summit had finished, we were just having this deep discussion. It was just me, Brad, and Greg left on the farm, and we're in his living room. And he's got this amazing bookshelf, and we're sort of having deep discussions about all sorts, but definitely like getting deeper about like what is the message of Future Whenua and what has come out of the weekend. And we're talking. It's really about this story that we telling ourselves about our place in the greater ecology. And so as we were sort of going back and forth about this, Greg goes to his bookshelf, and it's one of my favorite bookshelves I've ever, looked on, and he pulls out the book that I see behind you, The Web of Meaning.
Right.
And he said, do you know about this one? It's like, it's a really comprehensive, just overview about, I think the tagline is, our place in the tagline. It's merging traditional cult wisdom and scientific understanding to find our place in the universe.
Exactly, to find our place in the universe.
And so I just thought, oh wow, that's incredible. And I haven't yet read it. It's on my absolute must-read list. And but yeah, until that time, I was wondering if you could just give us the sort of synopsis of the book.
Yeah, sure. That sounds like a great place to begin. So what this book basically does is it looks at the way in which our sort of dominant culture makes sense of the world, what I call our worldview. And to understand what our worldview is, basically, you can sort of think of it almost like the lens that you see everything through. That it's not something, a worldview isn't something that people kind of discuss and say, okay, here's my worldview, and this is, or like when they're a kid, they don't get taught this is what you're meant to understand. It's just implicit in the way everything works, and everything, it's an implicit foundation of how everything is talked about. So the thing about a lens is you don't even realize you're seeing something through a lens until it's pointed out. And so what this book does is it shows how our dominant worldview is not just dangerous and basically leading us on this path to potentially total collapse of this civilization, as well as such destruction of the living earth, but it's also plain wrong. Like most people think that the way in which we make sense of things is scientifically based. Like, well, that's what science tells us. Like, for example, nature is selfish. We all know that, the selfish genes, and humans are selfish. We all know that. We evolved to be selfish, and humans are fundamentally separate from nature. But of course, these are things that we've just taken for granted as being some sort of scientific foundation. But they were based on ideas developed in the 17th century, hundreds of years ago, that modern science has totally superseded. So what the book does, like I say, the subtitle is Integrating Science and Traditional Wisdom to Find Our Place in the Universe. And it looks at all the big questions that basically any human being might ask at some point in their lives, like, who am I? Or what am I? Where am I? Or why am I? Or how should I live? These kind of big questions. And it shows that for every one of those, what our dominant worldview tells us is just wrong. And then it begins to show how what modern science points us to is a different kind of worldview of deep interconnectivity, deep connectedness with not just within the different parts of ourselves and with other human beings, but with all of life. And it shows how the great wisdom traditions of the past, whether it's Aboriginal traditions and other indigenous traditions, traditional Chinese thought, Buddhism, all of these different ways of thinking actually were also founded on this basis of deep interconnectedness. And so what we tend in our sort of world today to think, well, that kind of spiritual stuff or traditional stuff, well, that's not really scientific. That's this kind of woo-woo stuff. If you want to get into it, then that's fine, but don't think that's science. And what this book shows is the opposite is true, that what true, really modern, deep understanding of the world shows us scientifically actually points to the same wisdom of these traditions, this deep interconnectedness. And those traditions, of course, have had so many generations, and in some cases, thousands of years, to develop wisdom about what that interconnectedness means. And that's what we can learn in our modern day, to take that wisdom and apply it to this crisis we're facing right now.
That's awesome, man. Really well surmised. Could you tell us about maybe the process you went through to writing the book, and perhaps provide some examples, both traditional and scientific, of that led you to that understanding?
Yeah, sure. Well, the process of writing this book is actually something like a 15-year or so sort of journey or kind of odyssey for me. And actually, the work that went into this book was really the same body of work that went into an earlier book I wrote. It's called The Patterning Instinct. And the subtitle of that book was A Cultural History of Humanity's Search for Meaning. And it's no coincidence that both of those two books have meaning in the title, because what I went through about halfway through my life was a kind of an existential meltdown. I'd built my life actually in a very different direction. I actually had an MBA and started an internet company, took it public. And so there I was, sort of being this kind of successful entrepreneur. And I went through this experience where my wife at the time, she passed away some years back. She got very sick, and I left the company to look after her. Over a while of time, the company collapsed. I left it like too early to stand on its own 2 feet. And meanwhile, my relationship with her was kind of lost, because she went through this kind of borderline dementia. So for years, I was looking after her, but really alone in my life. And I was determined that whatever I did with my life was going to be truly meaningful, that I wasn't going to accept somebody else's ideas for what was meaning, but actually try to work out for myself, what could I really believe in that was truly meaningful? And I wanted something that would actually feel intellectually rigorous. I didn't want to just believe some guru somewhere telling me, oh, it's all like this or all like that. But I also wanted it to feel in my heart and my soul, whatever that was. I didn't know at the time what that even meant, but I wanted to feel that it was also meaningful in that place. So I started this kind of journey of it's kind of investigation. Is a little bit like sort of peeling the onion, sort of pulling layers out of what our received truths are, and beginning to look, where did that come from? Where did that come from? And sort of trying to fit the pieces together. So that earlier book, called the Patterning Instinct, was the result of this journey of my trying to look in sort of deep time. Where did our ideas actually come from? If we have ideas like God or soul or what it is, what's unique about humans or whatever, who said these things? Where did that come from? So that sort of took me all the way back to earliest human history, and then sciences like cognitive science and evolutionary biology, and all these different places. And I started to realize that everything that I had thought was true about where these ideas came from, or what's true about life, was actually just these kind of layers of ideas that have been shown not to be the case. So really, I was kind of, I went through years and years, not just of this intellectual reading and trying to understand the pieces, but my own embodied journey of investigation. So I'd sort of discovered things I'd never known anything about, like meditation, and then the traditional Chinese embodied practices like Qigong and Tai Chi. And it was really through those, as well as my kind of intellectual sort of journey, that I began to really see there was a different way we can make sense of things. So that earlier book looks historically about how different cultures, all the way from earliest hunter-gatherers, made sense of the world, and how that's actually shaped history and took us to this present-day massive meta-crisis that we're experiencing right now. And this more recent book, The Web of Meaning, offers a different path, like almost like a real solid, intellectually rigorous platform for how we could actually approach life in a different way that could lead, if enough people turned in that direction, we could lead our civilization onto a totally different path, a much healthier path towards flourishing.
That's fantastic, man. And yeah, it's amazing how much they do overlap. It seems like two quite distinct worlds until you get into it. And I suppose that's something we really wanted to be shown in our very name, Future Whenua. Future is the sort of technological and maybe more the scientific aspect of that. And Whenua, we use te reo very intentionally because, from my brief dip into the understanding of the culture, it does have this, te auturo, the interconnectedness, and it seems to line up very much with what you're saying that you've seen through these ancient societies and throughout time. And so I'm just, absolutely on board with you. And so just how those two overlap, is it around this interconnectedness? Like how else?
I think so. And in fact, maybe one way we can get at that is, there was one part of your question I didn't really answer, I realized, which was you asked for like examples of how it is that this dominant worldview is like gives us wrong answers to something, or what might be answers that are more consistent with our reality as it is. So, and that might lead us exactly to recognizing those connections. So, well, one example is this thing we're told that basically nature is like sort of complex machines, and we're driven by selfish genes. And this biologist, Richard Dawkins, way back when in the 1970s, wrote this book, The Selfish Gene, which was one of the most foundational books in sort of popular culture to give, huge bestseller. And he's oftentimes voted as, the most influential scientist, like in England or whatever, and where he lives. And I kind of, he was one of the first people I came across when I started to do my own investigation. And so this is a classic idea of how we think. Most people, who've even read a little bit of science, say, well, okay, that's how life works. We're all driven by genes. Genes are fundamentally selfish. They want to replicate themselves. And so they use organisms to do that. And that's how evolution works. So we just need to accept that. And they do that through outcompeting other genes. So if there is an organism with genes that don't lead the organism to be quite as fast or strong or whatever it might be, they're going to be outcompeted. They're just going to die off. It's a rat race out there. It's, it's like the law of the jungle, all that stuff. Sounds very convincing until you actually start looking at how biology actually works. And for example, what we find out now from modern science is that genes are not some little sort of intelligences that that dominate the organism. In fact, there's this interactivity, this complex interaction between like the cell and the gene. And the gene is one part of this unfolding of life. It's an important part, but it's more like a tool through which life learns things and passes it on to new generations rather than some sort of dominating intelligence of its own or whatever. But then even more amazing is evolutionary biologists now, when they look at how life evolved over billions of years on Earth, there's only been about 4 or 5 big jumps in the complexity of life, from what are called simple cells to nucleated cells to multicellular organisms, and then to say like mammals and social organisms, things like that, all the way to modern world. But what's amazing is every one of those big jumps in a complexity of life didn't come about through some organism outcompeting the others, but the opposite, through different organisms working together in what's known as mutually beneficial symbiosis, where each organism has a particular specialty and they work with the other one. They found a way where they could actually work for the benefit of the other. So by acting together, they actually created a whole that was far bigger and more, could do more than the separate parts could ever do. And that's actually how evolution works. So in fact, there was one systems biologist called Lynn Margulis, who said like life didn't sort of take over the world by competition, but by networking. That it was actually that cooperation that led to it. That doesn't mean there's no competition in nature. It just means that there's both competition and cooperation, causing a much richer sort of harmonic structure of ecosystems. But it does mean that it's cooperation that has led to the great breakthroughs of life. And I think similarly, for where we are right now as human beings, it's the potential for cooperation that can lead us to the breakthrough that we need if we're going to make it through this existential crisis we're facing. So that just gives you one example. And I'll just perhaps take through one more because it so relates, that we're told that what made humans special is that we outcompeted all the other creatures, right? And that we ourselves are sort of the most successful because we're the most selfish. And it's actually by being selfish that we get to do the greater good. And then we're told from that capitalism works so well because every person who pursues their own selfish needs and desires then ultimately through the invisible hand makes the world more efficient. And that's how efficient markets work. And that's kind of the underlying ideology of neoliberalism. But again, it comes through hundreds of years all the way from European thinking in the 17th century, is this idea of the intrinsic selfishness of each person. Again, what biology now shows, that is a complete fiction. In fact, if we look at how we evolved as primates, we and other primates like orangutans or chimpanzees or gorillas, whatever, we all evolved from the same common primate ancestor about 8 to 12 million years ago. What made humans actually distinct from the other primates was our very focus on cooperation. So a few million years ago, we found ourselves in this kind of dangerous savanna away from the jungle, and there were new kind of threats. It was a very changeable environment. And those humans that learned to cooperate together as a group were the ones that got to be most successful, that survived. And so over actually millions of years, our sort of hominid ancestors developed what are called moral emotions, where they're emotions that come out of our working together as cohesive groups. So we have things like embarrassment or guilt or shame or a sense of loving people who are generous. We just intrinsically like those kinds of people, and a sense of fair play. All those deeply felt emotions rise in us because of our human heritage. That's what makes us uniquely human. And so for most of human history, we were living in nomadic hunter-gatherer groups. And there was actually some tension between what other primates had, this kind of this drive for male dominance over the rest of the group. And what became distinctly human was this sense of fair play and cooperation. So there was this kind of somewhat delicate balance between the two, but the group dynamic of fair play and cooperation basically won out. It sort of was more powerful than the occasional selfish male who'd come around saying, I'm the best hunter, I want to take charge of this. That wouldn't happen. A lot of that shifted since the rise of agriculture, the last sort of 10,000 years or so. But that's a whole other story. But that's another example, though, of how science tells us one thing, or we think old science is saying something, and actually what modern science shows us is something completely different.
Mm. Yeah, I'm glad you sort of explained that so well, because it is quite fundamental. I think this mindset shift, then we're about ourselves and individualism, then we should actually just be working and making decisions based on the collective. And that if we work together, it's like this creating the biggest slice of the pie rather than just getting as much of it as we can. And yeah, you mentioned Richard Dawkins in there in the Shellfish Gene. I think one of the interesting things, I listened to him on Lex Friedman just recently, and he's talking down, and his Lex sort of quizzes him down to some of the stuff that is unknown, and Richard just like pawns it off to a scientific mystery, and he's adamant that it can't be God and it can't be anything supernatural. It can't be that. It's just a scientific. And I wonder why that scientific mystery can't be the place where God enters, whatever form that takes for, an atheist or non or a believer. So I think that's an interesting one. And another, just like this like Darwinism, that's so many people believe in this survival of the fittest and competition based on great scientists' work. But actually in his paper there was all this talk about cooperation and love
Right.
even, and it was sort of our interpretation, and for whatever reason, his legacy's been very orientated towards that survival of the fittest aspect of that paper, but it had a whole lot more about it than what you've just
Yes.
sort of alluded to.
Yeah, that's completely true. Yeah, I mean, really, Charles Darwin was a wonderful, amazing thinker. Obviously one of the greatest thinkers in all history, really. And he didn't really lead us in that direction. It was more the way it was interpreted led to this notion of survival of the fittest, and then became this kind of pseudo philosophical foundation for capitalism and all this kind of stuff. And what you're pointing to is that this notion of the sort of deep ultimate questions about life, that's also a very fascinating area that I go into some depth in this book, The Web of Meaning, because that notion of interconnectedness leads us to a very different place than what reductionist science leads us to. And that kind of Richard Dawkins way of thinking about science, and I don't want to always personalize about Richard Dawkins. There's tons and tons of reductionist scientists out there, but he definitely was maybe the most successful of all in setting these ideas out there. And so he's often the one, and he summarizes it so well that he's often the one that we'll sort of turn to kind of critique those ideas. But basically, this is part of this notion that science is fundamentally different, we're told, than any kind of spiritual meaning or anything like that, or in anything qualitative. The idea is that science just looks at the facts, and the facts tell us wherever they want to go, and the facts are sort of value neutral. And if we can choose to interpret them one way or the other, that's where we have sort of an imposed value, and that's where we can look for meaning if we want, but don't look to that through science. That's the sort of tradition that emerged over hundreds of years. And most people still think, well, that must be true, surely. But this is what's so interesting, is that there's that really arises from one approach to science, which is known as reductionism, which is important to sort of unpack that a little bit, because basically what reductionism is, it's the approach to science that says, if you break things down into the tiniest little parts, you can understand them better. And it was actually Descartes, who was one of the great scientists of the scientific revolution, who is also one of the ones that came up with this idea of humans being just the identity being the mind, like that famous statement from Descartes: "I think, therefore I am." Our sole identity comes from our thinking faculty. But he was also the one who defined reductionism as this project of breaking things down to their parts, and it was phenomenally successful. And that breaking stuff down into parts has really been the foundation of much of the success of science over hundreds of years, like whether it's in looking at the elements in chemistry, or the particles in physics, or genetic understanding in biology. And in every case, it's been incredibly valuable. Well, and we can all be incredibly grateful for it. The fact that I can talk to you from across the world right now can only happen because of the incredible triumphs of reductionism. But the thing is, what reductionists did, they got so sort of enamored by the success of what they were doing that they began to think that not just you could understand a lot of stuff by breaking it down, but everything in the universe could be understood by breaking it down into its parts. And that is the only way you can truly understand things in the universe. That's what I call in my book ontological reductionism. Because ontological simply refers to when you're like looking at the question of existence itself. That's what the word refers to. But what modern sciences like complexity science or systems science or chaos theory, and even sciences like network theory or evolutionary biology, what all of these different sciences show is that actually the connections between things are often even more important than the things themselves. That is one of the major sort of paradigm switches that modern ways of understanding things scientifically shows in a different way. And these are sciences that every bit as rigorous with peer-reviewed papers and Nobel Prize winners and all that stuff as reductionist science. But they look at things in a different way. They don't reject reductionism at all. They don't say, oh no, those parts aren't important. But what they say is sometimes when parts are connecting in complex systems, they form such complexity, a new emergent system arises out of it. And how that system works can only be understood when you look at the connecting elements of the system, not just what they're made of. That's the sort of key shift. And to get a sense of what I mean, well, you can just think of things in nature, like say you're looking at a river. You might swim in the river, then come back to it the next day, dive in. Well, obviously you're diving in the same river as you were the day before, but everything about that river is different, right? All the molecules, the water molecules they're made of are totally different. There's no water that's there that was there the day before, unless it's like stagnated in a little pool or whatever. So that gives a sense of how the relationship between things form the river, even while they keep changing. But it gets even deeper when we think about ourselves. Like imagine, say, like a photograph of yourself when you were a little child. Yeah, I mean, so if you put that in your mind's eye, well, you can look at that picture and it's you. You might remember that time the picture was taken or whatever. But what's amazing is that there's not a single molecule probably in your body right now that was in that little kid. I mean, most of our cells change from over the months. And there are a few cells that remain in the body all the way through our lives, but even those are continually changing what their components are, which is why you can be virtually certain there's nothing that makes up that little kid that is in you now. And yet that's you. So what connects you with that little kid? Basically, it's the way in which all those different parts connected up. They're organizing principles, as they're described in a sort of complexity science, is the organizing principles are more important. They're the things that form the neuronal connections that give you your memories. They're the things that form the different parts of you that you think of as a fixed thing, like your heart or your lungs, your organs or your hand, but they're actually changing all the time, but the patterns remain the same. That is this crucial insight that actually early traditions such as Buddhism or other traditional Chinese traditions recognized. They actually had words for the patterns that are more important than the things themselves. And when you start to follow along those lines, you begin to see that leads to places of more kind of spiritual understanding. We can even understand the very notion of meaning itself as being something that arises from the relation between things and from the way in which we relate to how things are interrelated. And we can even understand the very idea of spirituality as basically focusing one's attention on the relation between things rather than the things themselves.
That's really deep once again, Jeremy. And yeah, the focus on the relationship, the web of meaning. If it were just all these little dots here, then what's going to hold them together would fall. It's the lines that form between those nodes. That's what creates the web. And I think yeah. So that's found in Buddhism and ancient Chinese, and it's also in quantum mechanics. It's this relationship between particles and between everything. And in Te Ao Māori, there's a big focus on the relationships. And in ecology, Rob, my partner with Future Whenua, he came to me the other day, or he called me up actually, and he's like, you know about steampunk and solar punk? How about permapunk? And talking about permaculture, and then he sort of, and we evolved that to eco-punk actually, and but this idea that punk is sort of, if the technology was restrained to steam power, then what would a civilization in the far future look? And it's sort of like this fictional stories that are created around that. And so I ended up looking it up. Does eco-punk exist? And I was on this Reddit, and so solar punk is quite ecologically focused, but it's very much about like the techno-optimistic sort of future.
Right.
Like how does the technology evolve to look crazy if we can go and be aligned. But what the differentiation with eco-punk was, it was much more about the relationships and about the where the resources come from. So it was saying, if it was Star Wars, it's talking about the eco-punk Star Wars would be like they're on the Death Star and they're talking about how do they create the minerals that form the and who are the engineers that are doing this. So it's much more about the process and the relationships that are creating it than what is the great technology. So
I love that idea. I love the idea of eco-punk. And I think, you're looking in the right direction, like going like from sort of perma-punk to eco-punk, because ultimately it's that notion of how do ecosystems work? And, permaculture itself is basically, an interpretation, really brilliant understanding, but ultimately based on understanding nature itself. How does nature work? And that's that recognition. When we look at ecologies or ecosystems, we see, really that is the study of not individual organisms, but the study of the relationship between all the different organisms in an ecosystem that form this kind of much greater whole. So there's even this understanding that ecosystems themselves, in a way, have their own intelligence, and that intelligence can be understood as the kind of learning that arises from behaviors and like figuring out different organisms in nature, working out what's successful as a way to respond to environments based on past behavior. And that's what ecosystems have in them, like deep wisdom embedded basically within the genetic structures of all the different parts of that ecosystem, in which how they relate to each other. So this is actually one of the important things about when we sort of then look at where does this vision of an ecological civilization fit into this understanding, is that we can then get to realize that if we can learn some of the deep principles of nature itself, if we can learn how ecosystems have been so successful in having this rich abundance and staying, some ecosystems can stay resilient for millions of years in spite of all kinds of changes in climate and all things that happen, until humans came along and just basically slashed and burned their way through these ecosystems. And they could remain healthy and resilient almost indefinitely. How could they do that? And of course, ecologists and biologists have studied that, and they've come up with certain principles for that. And we can look at some of those key principles and apply that to human society, and then start asking this question: what could a human society look like if we based it on some of those deep principles of nature? And then applied them in ways that made sense to humans, because obviously humans are distinct and we have our unique special characteristics. So it doesn't mean that we just give up on all aspects of civilization and sort of just say, okay, well, let's just be wild like the rest of life. But we can actually in a way that was built on those same principles that allow that kind of success of ecosystems.
I think, Future Whenua, we're talking about the future of the land, and quite fortunate to have quite a movement and quite a framework already that we can adopt of this nature. With regenerative agriculture.
Right.
There is a huge swell, I think, globally, definitely in New Zealand. 5 years ago, regenerative, and now most people at least are aware of the idea, and it's really quite a developed set of tools and practices. But mostly, it is a philosophy, I think, which embodies a lot of the stuff that we've just been talking about. And so in practice, it looks like letting pastures grow longer and incorporating trees and shifting sheep more, because that's what would happen in nature. Big mob grazing that are moving around. So all of a sudden, we're starting to view our farm systems more like a natural ecosystem. And I just think there's quite a strong play there with regenerative agriculture to actually embody and enact some of the philosophical thinkings behind like this conversation.
I think that's completely right. And of course, what that does is it utilizes that notion that I touched on earlier of mutually beneficial symbiosis, because what you're really doing with regenerative agriculture is looking where that symbiosis takes place between different crops that actually can actually work symbiotically, synergistically together, or where different organisms can affect the soil in ways that are good for them while they actually enhance the nutritional quality of the soil for other plants to grow there, and all these things. And that's really a lot of what permaculture is about, is observing those places of symbiosis and then looking at how they can be applied consciously and intentionally. So that really, once you've set the conditions in place, there's, in principle, less and less for you to do. You can just let the whole sort of new ecosystem you've set up unfold and let it do its thing to a large degree.
One of the first principles in permaculture is about observation, and
Right.
it's about developing that lens that you started off with, the worldview.
Mm-hmm.
So if we develop our ecological lens. I did an online course with Mark Shepherd once on forest ecology, and that's the primary outcome from that course was it helped develop this way to view. So when you walk in the bush, or if I drive to a new place and I see a totara tree that's got its branches going like that, I can tell where the prevailing wind was. And before intentionally developing that, ecological lens or that worldview, I would have just driven past and seen nothing, but it sort of made me a lot more aware of those things. So when people really start digging into, okay, how can we grow food with nature, as a part of nature, as opposed to how do we grow food on nature?
Right.
Exactly. It is a different thing, and it leads down pathways that allow us to open our eyes to different aspects of it.
I think that's right, which really leads to another of these sort of deep principles of ecosystems that could actually be applied to an entire civilization, which in the book, in the Web of Meaning, I refer to it as fractal flourishing, which kind of has this notion, like for people who aren't quite sure what the word fractal means, it refers to patterns that repeat themselves at different scales. So the same kind of pattern, but at different scales, you'll see it. And so what you see is all of nature basically is fractal, or pretty much everything, so you can see fractal patterns in the leaves on trees or on tree branches themselves, or you see them. You see fractals in things like coastlines and like sand dunes, and even in things like the way galaxies are organized. So fractal patterns are basically everywhere in the universe, and as well as our own neural patterns in our brains or our lungs are fractal. But the idea of fractal flourishing is this realization that in an ecosystem is fractal, in the sense the principles that make one organism healthy and alive are similar to the principles that make the whole species come alive or the whole ecosystem. And one particular animal might look very different from the ecosystem as a whole, but the underlying principles are similar. So what fractal flourishing points us to is the realization that you can't be successful or healthy as part of the larger ecosystem unless the whole system itself is also healthy. That for one part of the system to flourish, the whole system needs to flourish. That's what our dominant civilization right now has gotten so wrong, that people just take for granted that nature is there for us to abuse and exploit and take what we want from, as if it's this kind of limitless sort of pit that we just take what we want and optimize for our human benefit. But what the kinds of approaches that you're talking about, that you're doing, that we see with regenerative agriculture, and that can apply to basically all of life, is actually looking at asking, what is it that we can do that doesn't just minimize our harm to non-human nature, but actually regenerates non-human nature? What is it, the nature that life is asking for us? So when you're looking at setting up something near a river, obviously it's prudent and good to say, how can we not pollute the river with something? That's a good place to begin. But then you can go beyond that and say, what can we do that could be give our welfare for ourselves that could actually also be good for the river, so that it actually can help to enhance that river and the ecosystem around it. When you start asking that question, then things move into a very different direction. And there's actually an ecological philosopher who lives in Australia. Her name is Freya Matthews, who is really profound thinker on these ideas, and she is one of the leading thinkers who's come up with how we can ask that question as a profoundly different way of relating to life.
It's amazing. In Aotearoa, we have, I think quite a proud distinction of we're the first country to give legal distinction to a body of water, the Wanganui River, I think. And I think that's quite a big mindset shift, if we give that legal power. And so we sort of are legally bound to consider that question. And I know one of your upcoming books is talking about sort of animist intelligence. And I think in past cultures, we had an animist belief system that there was a spirit in this tree. So I just wondered if you could maybe explore further that animist intelligence and maybe even just explaining what is intelligence.
Great. Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, and actually that's something I go into in a lot of depth in the Web of Meaning is that notion of, and I call it actually animate intelligence is the word I use, which sort of like you can just think of as in contrast to inanimate, something that is kind of, we think of as dead or fixed. And really it's the intelligence in life itself. And intelligence is a really great way to sort of get into some of these deeper questions, because the way that our dominant culture thinks of intelligence is something basically that's kind of uniquely human. It's this way of sort of problem solving using a higher level general awareness of what's going on, so that no matter what the situation is, with greater intelligence, you can apply principles from one place to another and solve those problems. And if we can, I was mentioning Descartes before, who was the first thinker hundreds of years ago, who sort of defined this modern view of intelligence coming from this notion of I think, therefore I am. And there was this kind of belief that intelligence is something that solely arises through what we can think of as our conceptualizing faculty. That the sort of standard way of looking at things is, well, what makes humans unique is we have language, we think symbolically, like we do have a more advanced prefrontal cortex in our brains than other creatures in relation to the size of our body. And that is the part of our brain that evolved as humans to allow us actually to have a social intelligence, which also then developed into this way of developing symbolic thinking and conceptualizing thinking. So we can, with language, we can come up with abstract ideas and develop, all kinds of things like mathematics and science and creative poetry and all this wonderful stuff. And so, but again, just like I was saying before, how reductionists got caught up to thinking their approach was the only way of making sense of things in the universe. So similarly, because of the success of of that conceptual thinking for humans, we got to think in our dominant culture that is the only intelligence that exists. So when we have things like IQ scores, what the IQ tests, we think is some objective test. Like if you score high in IQ score, then it must mean that you are objectively more intelligent than other people. That we sort of think of it that way, just like if you're measuring how tall you are, what's your IQ score? Actually, it just measures one aspect of intelligence, which is a particular pattern-making, conceptualizing ability that, because it's actually been emphasized in the modern world. Believe it or not, IQ scores in general have gone up steadily over the last 100 years or so in each generation, because it's the kind of thinking that is encouraged. So people think more and more in that way, and so their IQ scores get higher. But we as humans also have a kind of intelligence that we share with all of life on Earth, which is called animate intelligence. And animate intelligence is this evolved intelligence in any living being, all the way down to a single cell, that actually relates to the world in incredibly complex ways. In fact, what's amazing is that cellular biologists, now as they study just a single cell, we have about 40 trillion cells in each of our bodies. A single cell has so much complexity that it probably has more intelligence than our greatest supercomputer. It actually will take in thousands of different signals at the same time. It organizes them all together in this incredibly complex melange, and it makes decisions. It determines what to do from moment to moment. Even single cells can work together in groups, make collective decisions as groups. And then, of course, you expand from single cells. We sort of think of trees and plants as kind of dumb, right? Well, they don't do anything. They just take in the sun and have roots, and that's pretty much it. It turns out that a plant can actually relate to the environment without something like 14 different sensory mechanisms. We have our 5 senses. Plants have about 3 times that many. They can sense things like chemical gradients in the soil, electromagnetic frequencies, pressure, all kinds of things that we couldn't even start thinking about. And it puts all that together, and it actually can be acted in intelligent ways. Plants relate intelligently to what's going on around them. They will cooperate as groups. There's a biologist called Suzanne Simard, who studied how forests work. And what she's found is that the roots of trees, actually through a relationship with a fungal network under the ground called the mycorrhizal network, they'll actually communicate with other trees all around the forest. And they'll actually relate to each other. They'll tell each other if there's a dangerous species arising that the plants need to develop their own chemical responses to. They'll even actually share nutrients through this mycorrhizal fungal network. So stronger trees in the middle might be able to share nutrients with younger trees that might need a nutrient more during a particular season. That's the kind of intelligence that plants have. And of course, that doesn't even go to the more advanced, what we sort of think of as advanced mammals, like say wolves or elephants or cetaceans in the ocean, who have deep wisdom and deep forms of intelligence that we can't even begin to conceive. So our human intelligence is, we can think of it more, rather than that, oh, we humans are uniquely intelligent among the rest of life. We can think of it more that our particular conceptual intelligence is a little bit like one particular peak on a landscape. And there might be other peaks of different kinds of intelligences out there that we don't recognize as such, because we are not looking for them, because we just define everything according to our own sense. So once you begin to realize that, it opens us up to see that we have animate intelligence within us. We're not just our conceptual intelligence, but we're also human-bodied, embodied mammals like other mammals around us. So we have this deep animate intelligence in our sort of core of our bodies. Where, like, if I'm in the same room as you and I suddenly pick up a ball and throw it at you, you'll be able to raise your hand and catch it without even thinking about what you're doing. That's your animate intelligence at work. You'll relate to things in different ways. You might be looking at somebody you're close to, and you'll through gazing at them, you'll be noticing different things in them moment to moment. You couldn't even begin to actually conceptualize, but your deep animate intelligence is relating to that. So once we as humans begin to realize that, these wonderful things happen. The first is that we get connected with the different parts of our own embodied life. We begin to realize we're not these separate brains sitting in this kind of sort of prison of flesh and bones kind of thing, and what scientific geeks sometimes call wetware or whatever. We actually are an embodied part of life. And it also gives us a gateway to actually connect with the intelligence all around us. We can begin to feel this shared connection with all of life. So that becomes a gateway for us to realize that we're not actually, as humans, separate from nature. We are nature. We're one aspect of nature, but we're all part of this unfolding life that's been on this earth for billions of years.
All right, man. That's pretty awesome. Might just shift tracks a little bit here, and just to this ecological civilization and fractal flourishing, and just maybe what does that physically look like in terms of of changes we make in society from now moving forward?
Yeah,
and perhaps to explore this question, let's say your calendar's right free, and you've got a book to write, and it's a political book, and it's perhaps policy actions or directive steps for society to take us towards a civilization. I just wonder what would the steps be that you'd go to write that book, and what might come out about it, or who might be really important voices in that conversation that you'd get lessons from.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks for that question. And in fact, that's what I'm working on now for my next book. It's actually going to be called Future Flourishing: Pathways Toward an Ecological Civilization, which is going to really be really exploring what it would actually mean to actually have this life-affirming civilization. So the first thing to really look at when we think about that is to realize that what that term ecological civilization means is it's not just that wonderful word ecological, like taking principles from life, but it's this recognition that we need to change the very foundation of our civilization. We're not going to get to that place of future flourishing by simply doing a few good things, by increasing the amount of organic farms or whatever, or investing more in renewables, or increasing taxes on the wealthy. All those things are absolutely crucial, important things to do. But those, it's like superficial changes alone are not going to get us there. We have to recognize that our very civilization is built on basically principles of exploitation and extraction, principles of being separate from nature and looking at nature just as a resource to exploit and extract. And also on this notion of humans basically looking at their relationship with others in society as being relationships of exploitation and competition. So that's the basis on which our entire economy and system and financial systems and global systems in general have been built on. But if we were to look at an ecological civilization, we'd be starting it from the basis of setting the conditions for all humans to be able to flourish on a regenerated planet, on an actual healthy living earth. And so to do that, we basically have to shift this foundation of our economic system of capitalism. We have to look clearly that it's not a matter of trying to say, oh, we need to have a nicer form of capitalism, like conscious capitalism or regenerative capitalism, whatever. We have to recognize that capitalism itself is really a system that is based on the primacy of capital, of actually saying that the job of the civilization is to set the conditions for capital to actually get accumulated as fast as possible. And the rest of life is seen as a resource to exploit. And it's no surprise that this actual basis of capitalism arose in Europe at the same time as that scientific revolution that gave us all these other like wrong-headed ideas about life that we've been talking about. And so when we're looking at making that shift, what we need to look at, for example, is the very notion of corporations themselves. Right now, our global society is totally dominated by corporations. If you look at the 100 largest economies in the world today, about 79 of the 100 are actually not countries, but transnational global corporations. They're the ones that basically dominate every aspect of life, whether it's finance or media or mining or agriculture, you name it. It's those big corporations. And they've become so strong now that our so-called democracies basically are just kind of hand in hand with the executives of these corporations. They oftentimes countries will compete against each each other to try to reduce taxes and get rid of all kinds of regulations so they can attract the corporations to invest in their own particular region or whatever. So one of the most fundamental things we need to do is look at the fact that those corporations themselves are driven by maximizing shareholder returns. And so we're right now, our system is dominated by companies that are not there for the benefit of people, not there to try to regenerate the earth, but are there to maximize returns at the expense of all of us. And you can change some of these things quite simply. And it would take a massive political shift, but the actual change wouldn't be so drastic. Simply, and there's a notion of a triple bottom line that right now, there's some organizations like B corporations or benefit corps that have the legal structure where a company can choose to reincorporate according to a triple bottom line. So it's legally bound to try to maximize not just profits, but also what are called people and planet, like optimize the environment and for its workers and for its customers and for those who live around its plants and all those things. Right now, it's had virtually no impact on the world because it's voluntary. So of course, the big corporations wouldn't even dream for an instant of organizing themselves according to that. But just imagine a world where every corporation above a certain size was required to actually be organized according to a triple bottom line. And those charters would come up for renewals every 5 years, and they would only be able to continue in business if basically a panel of people, not just the experts close to them, but a panel chosen by a sortition, could actually determine if they were truly meeting that triple bottom line of profit and people and planet. Imagine the change that would happen all overnight. The CEOs and executives would be actually thinking about things in a different way. It wouldn't be like, how do I make the most money? It'd be, how do I make sure that our company can be existence in the future? So how can we really care about our ecological footprint? And how can we care about what our employees, how they're living and all these different aspects? So that's just one example of what we could see in an ecological civilization. There's many others, but that's a key one.
Quite a fundamental one. Yeah, our economic system is just the driver of human activity. So if we reassess how we, produce and distribute resources, then that's going to go a long way. Fractal flourishing. I've just had this idea on farm about fractal diversity as a concept that we could explore, and so that's. If we plan to winter crop with many different species in it, the sunflower and the swede and the faba bean, they're going to be photosynthesizing and sending different root exudates to the soil, and that's going to enliven a diverse microorganisms in the soil. So we've got this diversity at the plant level, which is feeding and enhancing the diversity below ground, which then in plants makes more healthier plants. And so those are two different levels at which we can enter in the diversity, but also to take it like a big step further is having diverse at the systems level. So rather than just having sheep to graze those things, that the chickens follow in behind, and then maybe we have some people that are learning about it, so we can have more farmers. And so it's just, I thought that was just like a tangible, on farm about how to approach this fractal flourishing, because you flourish. Yeah. You have flourishing plants if you have a flourishing microorganism, and you have a flourishing system if you sort of incorporate all of that. So
I love that, Zeb. That's brilliant. And that's, again, that is learning from nature itself, because one of the things we see in ecosystems is exactly what you're describing, that diversity. There's no such thing as an ecosystem that doesn't have rich diversity. And that's one of the ways in which our dominant civilization is destroying things, by homogenizing crops. So sometimes they'll talk about, we're reforesting, and so we're doing something good. And what they're doing is actually killing the diversity in an area and planting a whole bunch of exactly the same tree, so they can then harvest the trees, some years later or whatever. That is killing the richness of nature. So diversity but it's a particular kind of diversity. It's not like just a whole range of randomly different things, but in ecosystems and in exactly what you're describing, the different parts are diverse in an integrated way, where they're actually part of something bigger, where the different symbiotic relationships between them, they're all connected up in this kind of complex, integrated web of connections, which is, which is very different from just a whole lot of separate things that stay separate. And so that's where what you're describing is such a beautiful model of exactly what we're talking about. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, just two questions. And so this first one is a big one, but I'll just ask you to give your network, the Deep Transformation Network, and what you're talking here about how we can shift to that does actually have a lot of hope in it, because it gives us time and it gives us something that we can succeed. But there is this conversation between deep transformation and deep adaptation, which is more like we're out of time. We do still need to be making these changes, but it needs to be in preparation for what's coming. And I just wonder if you could explore the difference between those two.
Yeah, great question. And this is a profound issue, which anybody who's looking at what's going on in the world right now has to deal with themselves in very deep emotional and spiritual places, which I also have been looking at and working through myself. I mean, basically, when we look at what's happening and we look at the climate breakdown and the ecological devastation and how things just are getting worse and worse, and the political polarization around the world, and the rise of neo-fascism in so many places, the rise of the billionaires who are just out there to exploit. It's very hard not to just look at how that's unfolding and be convinced that it's too late, that we're just headed for a collapse. And the best we can do is just prepare ourselves for that and look at how we can sort of just kind of focus on our particular community and just dig down and look out for ourselves, whatever that might be. And there is no doubt in my mind that we are looking right now at a trajectory that is leading faster and faster toward that precipice. But to my understanding, knowing that we're on that trajectory doesn't mean basically giving up or saying like it's too late. Because one of the things that we discover about complex systems, and as I describe in the Web of Meaning, is our entire society is an incredibly complex system. And complex systems, by their very nature, are non-linear, which means that the ways that they react, there's so many complex interactions going on that you can never like look at one line sort of moving forward and say it's going to continue in that direction until something happens. There's these incredible shifts and transitions that can happen within systems, one that are very difficult to expect. And so when we understand what is going on, what we need to recognize is, one, that a few simple changes are not enough. This is why the network that you're a member of, that I actually just founded earlier this year, is called the Deep Transformation Network. It's this online network of people recognizing the dire situation we're in, but recognizing that the kind of transformation we need has to be a deep transformation, like that shift towards an ecological civilization. And none of us know if it's too late or not. We know that it's too late for some parts of life on this earth. It's probably almost certainly too late for coral reefs in the ocean. No matter what happens, as there's so much warming and acidification embedded in the system right now, we're seeing coral reefs bleaching more and more out of control each year. And most people predict by the middle of the century, they'll be virtually dead. These are tragic, disastrous events unfolding in our time. But the fact that it's too late for a lot of stuff on Earth right now, and too late for a lot of people in the global South who are already suffering the devastation of climate breakdown. It is too late in some ways for some people who are suffering it right now. It's not too late to turn things around for future generations. There is a possibility. None of us know what the probabilities are. None of us can assign a statistical number to it. But there's a possibility, as long as there's enough of us connecting together and looking at these issues together, of hitting a critical mass, a transition where more and more people get to wake up, realize things are going in the wrong direction, realize there are alternatives, and start to move together in basically mass people-based grassroots movements to shift things around. I'm not saying that's likely. I'm not necessarily an optimist myself, but I know that that's what life is calling on each of us to do, is to put ourselves into that mystery and work on what's possible. And as you're doing, and as so many people are doing, and people in the network are doing, to just take their own life energy and find the most skillful way they can be part of this transition towards what's possible.
Thanks for that, man. I've got like shivers going down the spine. But from a purely mathematical lens, there is a possibility that things are gonna, shit's gonna hit the fan. So we should have some sort of like physical and mental preparation for that. We should be priming and becoming intimate with some of the emotions of collapse in advance, so it doesn't knock us off. And we should, have a store of canned beans. But we should also hold on to the possibility that we turn the ship around and we do reach an ecological civilization, and we have a prosperous future for generations that will follow us. And we know that we can increase that possibility if we take profound, strong actions and redirect our worldviews in such a manner that will bring it about. So, thanks for exploring those two. And last question is really just to help me come to terms with the name of this podcast, Future Whenua Yarns. So like many things, it just came, so we went with it, and it was sort of on a somewhat shallow basis. Even Future Whenua was somewhat just because I like alliteration, but then the more we explored it, it was this balancing of the traditional and scientific and everything else that we've thought about over time. And then yarns was sort of just, when I was traveling, it's this Kiwiism, having a yarn, it's this casual banter. But following your work, and then that took me to Tyson Younger Porter, and there's this deep actual traditional concept of yarning as a conversation. And I thought, that's, once again, it was just this sort of relatively shallow thing, but there's a lot of depth there. And I just wonder if you could explore what yarning is.
Yeah, well, I've had the real honor to be in a couple of yarns with Tyson Younger Porter. And so I do get a sense of that kind of deep, deep wisdom that's coming out of. And I feel, you probably have a more embodied understanding of yarning because you've been living with it there sort of in Aotearoa than I have. But my sense is this manifestation of this deep wisdom that goes back through the generations. And it's almost like an archetypal wisdom. A part of what I explore in my book is what I call cultural attractors, which are like sort of patterns of thoughts or behavior, or could be patterns of wisdom that get transmitted over generations, like sort of archetypes as an example of a cultural attractor. But other elements of wisdom, ways of being in relation with each other, get transmitted over generations. And one of the things that is unique about humans is that we are storytellers, and the way in which those poles of wisdom, those elements of wisdom get transmitted is oftentimes not as much through books like the ones I write, like which are more conceptual. Here's the ideas, here's what science says, etc. But they're actually transmitted through stories, because when we hear stories, we pick up the deeper implicit meaning in those stories, and they become models of behavior. And we actually emotionally relate to those stories. We take them internally, because as humans, we're social creatures. And so when something happens in a story between people, we relate to it in a way we can't just relate to something that is in our conceptual intelligence. So we were talking before about animate intelligence. Really, we can think of like yarns, when they're story-based, when they're based on traditional wisdom, as actually connecting that conceptual intelligence we as humans have with that deeper animate intelligence. So I think that's a wonderful name that you have for it. And I definitely recommend keeping it. I really was attracted to the name as soon as you told me about it.
Nice one, man. Well, I'm truly honoured to be having this yarn with you, and I really do want this to be a collection of conversations that sort of archive some important ideas and practices and everything else that will aid particularly the rural sector in this transition towards an ecological civilization. So I really cherish this conversation, and I'm really grateful for all your work. So I would just recommend anyone listening to this to get the book, Web of Meaning. Perhaps if you found goodness in that, then get the Patterning Instinct also, and join the Deep Transformation Network, and have this conversation in there.
Great. Well, it was really great talking to you, Zeb, and I look forward to connecting more on the network, as well as anybody else who wants to get engaged in those conversations. So thank you. Take care now.
Ka kite, Jeremy.
Wow. Okay.
Okay. Well, that was pretty bloody awesome, man. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's great conversation. Yeah, really enjoyed it, Zeb. Yeah, and thanks for just everything you're doing, and I just feel the caring and the real beautiful way you're putting things together. So really appreciate it, and let's stay in touch on the network.
Likewise. I've got to get back to the Bay next year. I've got booked the New Zealand winter. I want to spend a couple months over there. And first stop will definitely be catching up with my sort of rugby mates in San Francisco. So if the stars aligned, maybe I'll be able to come catch up and have one of these yarns in the flesh.
Sounds great, Zeb. Okay, take care, my brother.
You as well.
Bye.
Bye.